Hi, I'm Andrew Moy, and in this clip we're going to talk a little bit about the techniques of spey casting. Really what I'm going to do here is introduce you to spey casting a little bit more. What I really want to talk about though is how to load the rod and a couple really key things to think about when you're casting. And not just spey casting. I'm really focusing on spey casting here, but what I'm telling you today, you can apply to your single-handed casting as well. These 2 points are super critical to making an effective cast. There's actually a few points, but there's 2 main ones. My first point, the first thing I want to just tell you about is the fact that you need the line to be tight in order to start your cast. If there's any slack in your line, you cannot get the line moving. You have to have a tight line, a straight line, before you can start your cast. So when you go to start a spey cast or a single-handed cast, it really doesn't matter. Make sure that your line is tight, there's no slack, and that there's tension. The other thing you want is a low rod tip. So you always start with tension in the line and a low rod tip. So if you're in your backyard and you're in your grass and you're practicing with your single-handed rod, cast the line out. Just get it out straight before you execute a good cast, or you try to execute a good cast while you're practicing. That's number one. But the 2 main points that I want to touch on today, number one is acceleration. You need to accelerate to make any cast work. Single hand, double hand, overhead, spey, it doesn't matter. You got to accelerate in order to make your cast work. And you have to accelerate on both your back cast and your forward cast. I'm going to show you here how not accelerating really hurts your cast, okay? And the first thing I'm going to show you, I'm just going to do an overhead cast with the rod. This is a spey rod, obviously. Well, normally we would spey cast, but I'm going to do an overhead cast. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to start fast. And by starting my stroke fast, what I'm doing is I'm loading the rod early in my stroke. And by starting fast, it's very hard to accelerate because it's hard to start fast and to gain speed. So by starting fast, what I'm doing is I'm loading the rod early, and as I'm doing my stroke, as I'm decelerating, or I'm slowing down, I'm hesitating. So I start fast, I load the rod early, and as I hesitate, what happens is the line catches up to the rod. By the time I stop my rod, there's no bend in the rod, so the line doesn't go anywhere. So watch how fast I move the rod right now, but how the line doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't respond to the rod. You see, I moved the rod really quick. What happened was I bent the rod early, and as I slowed down, the line caught up to the rod. By the time I stopped the rod, there was no bend in the rod. The line went nowhere. Now watch how the next overhead cast is way more efficient. I go much slower, but the line responds to the rod, and the line jumps back behind me. It shoots behind me into my back cast. And in any cast, you need a back cast in order to have a forward cast. And you need your back cast to straighten out. Really, the only way to get your back cast to straighten out is to accelerate. So watch this cast. Now I'm going to go really slow, and I'm going to gain speed, and I'm going to stop the rod. By stopping the rod, I'm allowing the rod to unload the energy that I've built in the rod by accelerating. So I accelerate to an abrupt stop. And I'm going to simply do that by going really slow, gain speed, and stop. And look at how the line just jumped right back behind me. That is super critical to your casting. You have to accelerate. So with that in mind, really the best way to practice, and for the beginner, it's harder because in the beginning, as you're learning, you're really thinking about what you're doing. And what happens is you tend to hesitate because it's like, oh, my stroke's not right, so you kind of slow down during your stroke. That's really bad because what happens is, again, is you're unloading the rod. The line's catching up to the rod, and it really makes your cast difficult. If your rod path is perfect, your rod tip tracks just right, but you don't accelerate, the cast won't work. So it's very hard to learn if you're not accelerating. The number one thing to start with is learn how to accelerate first. So again, acceleration is super critical. So let me do a spey cast here, and I'll show you how acceleration, or how it works for you, and how not accelerating doesn't work for you. So here I'm going to do a bad cast, where I'm going to do a snap first. I'm going to set my anchor first. That was good. But now as I do my sweep, I'm going to start fast and kind of hesitate. And you can see the line just dives out in front of me and falls onto the water. It's not going to work. You got to get your line back into the D-loop. So on the next one, I'm going to just flow through it. Set the anchor. I'm going to just sweep the rod back, not stop, not hesitate, just continually accelerating. So as a beginner, back to my point, is instead of thinking about what you're doing while you're doing it, while you're executing your stroke, just think about what you're doing prior to doing your stroke and then commit to it. You have to commit to your stroke in order to accelerate. So, one, don't overthink the cast, and two, commit to it. Really work on committing to your cast. So that's my main point to get started in fly casting, and in this case, spey casting. On to my next point. Probably one of the number one mistakes I see is over-rotation and leading with the rod tip. Okay, over-rotation means simply that the rod is coming too far back on my back cast and it's causing the fly line to come behind me. Once the line comes behind me, you cannot load the rod properly. You need to have the fly line directly opposite your target. And for me, as a righty caster, as I cast back, the line can only go as a righty clockwise. So as I cast back and that line comes around behind me, it's never going to come back to that 180-degree line. Again, that 180-degree line is the line that is directly opposite where I'm trying to cast. So if I'm casting that way, my 180 line is this way, directly opposite. My fly line needs to line up on that 180, and by over-rotating, I'm causing that fly line to come off of that 180. And again, it'll never come back to it once it rotates behind you. So over-rotation is a very common mistake, probably the number one mistake in all of casting, and especially in spey casting. Probably where over-rotation starts to happen is right from the beginning of the stroke. Not probably, actually, it definitely does. What I see for most people when they over-rotate is they're leading with the rod tip. What I mean by that is they're bringing the rod tip back first, and at that point, what happens is A, the rod over-rotates, and B, it leaves my hands out front. It's very hard to start to kind of bring the rod back first like this and keep it tracking in a straight line. What we need to do is track the rod more straight back in line like this. We're pulling the rod back. If we look at the rod here, it's at an angle. We call this 12 o'clock. This is 1 o'clock. I'm going to keep the rod at 1 o'clock as long as possible. Keep it at 1 o'clock as long as possible and then push the rod out. So that keeps my rod tracking on a straight line so I can execute a good cast.